Today we have author Jon Zelazny with us, and Jon is a friend of mine from the infamous Studio City Writers Group, right? But I haven't seen you for a while. I haven't been there either, but I haven't seen you for a while.
They've been doing Zooms, but I haven't been participating.
Yeah, I hear. So, what have you been up to lately?
As far as writing goes, really just getting stuff out there. I do a lot of submissions. I'm trying to get, nobody is picking up a novel, but what I'm having some success with is having excerpts published in small magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book we're going to talk about today, Constant Mayhem, which is about the early days of the Who, I've actually had 4 pieces of that published in books so far. So hopefully that's the way to build cred to get the book deal for the whole thing. So I've been doing a lot of that, and just started the next novel. So
That's cool. I wanted to ask you what I know you're into music, but what inspired you to write a book about Kit Lambert? I mean, he's a real person, or he was a real person, but what, motivated you to write that story?
I would say my interest in behind the scenes rock and roll stuff goes all the way back to when I was 12 years old and I saw the movie A Hard Day's Night. And one of my favorite characters in that is the road manager, who's played by Norman Rossington, but the sort of grown up who's kind of responsible. He's sort of the chaperone, and he's not really the manager; he's the road manager. But I just love that aspect of somebody has to be responsible for this band.
Right.
And I'm the kind of person, I'm a big music fan, and as I would read about a group or as I would listen to a group, I would try and find a book about them. So I was always reading rock bios.
Yeah.
And any great band or anybody who became a huge success usually has some kind of a colorful manager, some sort
Right.
of a guiding visionary who, steers them.
If you like our videos, go ahead and click on like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
And because I can't play music myself, I think I just sort of always was interested in these kind of people. And there's lots of different characters who were, and some of them were pretty shameless characters, and some were, really above board and did great things. And why I finally settled on Kit Lambert was in the span of 6 years. This was a guy who had no background in the rock and roll. He simply wanted to be involved he was originally a filmmaker, and he was a guy looking for a band to shoot a film of.
Mm-hmm.
And so he ventured into these clubs looking for an act that he could shoot, probably inspired by Hard Day's Night as well. It had just come out that year. And so he was a guy who found a band, and within a year, I don't really want to make a film of these guys. I want to manage them.
Right.
And I'm sure he got into it not for artistic reasons. I think he got in to be a player, to be on the scene, to make money, to, be flashy. He was this kind of guy. And yet, pretty quickly, he got very interested in the art of it. He got very interested in what you could do with pop music, and he was very inspired. And most of these guys stay away from records. I mean, they don't get involved in making music. And Kit Lambert was a guy who he sat in on some sessions and he sat through the first couple records, and he was a guy who said, I want to make the record myself.
Right.
And he took over as their record producer. And I don't think he became one of the great producers in history, but he did a pretty solid job on the Who Sell Out, and then on Tommy. Tommy is his crowning achievement as a producer, and he developed that story. He was very involved in the entire process of Tommy. And that was only 6 years after he found these teenagers playing covers in a dive bar.
Wow.
He took these guys so far in just a very short amount of time, and really went on a personal journey himself that I thought was just fascinating. And because it's all internal, what is this guy thinking? What calculation is he making every step of the way as he does these things? And I thought it was fascinating.
I was reading a little bit about him, and I guess they had some falling out. He had some falling out with the Who. Like, he did something, and then Pete Townsend kind of overlooked that and worked with him again, or something like that, right?
My novel goes from finding the band in '64 to premiering Tommy at the Met in New York in 1970. And that's the scope. Thereafter, it's extremely depressing, and it's no fun, and it's fighting, and it's drugs, and it's self-destruction. It's very painful, and I didn't want to tell that. I didn't want to talk about the long, slow decay of a relationship.
Right.
I wanted to end on a high note, And at the same time, you get the sense that it's probably not going to end up too well for this guy. You know, everything that he did to get him to that high point was going to bite him on the way down. And so I didn't want to tell the long fall. And it was very difficult and painful, as it was for most people who signed a deal in the 60s. You know, if you started to make a lot of money, you started to realize a good chunk of it is going to these people that I signed these papers with.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, when I was reading the piece in the writers group, somebody asked me sometime, well, why were these people so stupid about money? And right around that time was when the movie about NWA came out. And these guys did the same thing. They made a deal with the first person who came along, and then it's a big problem as you try and work your way out of that. You know, it's something that plagues young musicians.
Even to this day.
To this day, you know, it doesn't really change. And so it was a good question. That's what I liked about writers group, is you would get these questions that would make you think, and you'd say,
right,
yeah, what can I say about that? And the answer I came up with for what would have been the mentality of the Who in 1964, 1965, they probably, what everybody knew about musical success was Elvis Presley. And Elvis Presley was the guy, he had Colonel Tom Parker, and Parker did everything.
Sure.
All Elvis did was sing, and that was it. And as far as anything about business, movies, records, touring, everything else was on Parker. And that's, I think, what young people at that time would have thought. Hey, we get a manager, they do all that, and we just enjoy it and get rich and do the music, you know. And
right.
That's my best guess as to what the mentality was, is we sign a deal and then that person takes care of everything. And it was a painful lesson for all these huge rock stars. You know, David Bowie is another case where by the mid 70s, you realize, oh my God, I made the worst deal possible in the world, and now I have to get out of it somehow.
Yeah.
So, you guys hear about what Taylor Swift did recently?
Yeah.
She re-recorded her songs. I thought that was brilliant for her to outsmart them.
Yeah, but again, it's the same thing that you when you're young and you sign these deals, that when you become a superstar, it's very hard to get out of them.
Yeah, so, even Prince notoriously had that happen to him. That's why he became the symbol, because he wanted to get away from, you know, from Prince.
And in the case of Kit Lambert, he did the amazing things with this group. He worked closely with Pete Townsend. He cultivated him. At the same time, they were taking 40% of their earnings. 40% of every pound was going into the, you know, he and his partner.
And the rest was going to taxes.
Yeah. I mean,
what I don't understand is, why didn't they just say, okay, then we're not going to perform anymore. We're going to split up and you get nothing. You either renegotiate with us and take a lower percentage, or you get nothing.
Well,
that's what I would do.
Again, this isn't in my novel. It's not what I really go into. But in the case of Pete Townsend, who was the main songwriter of the band, who worked most closely creatively with Kit Lambert, he feels a tie to him mentally and spiritually, physically, that the others don't. So Roger Daltrey says, why is this guy getting all this money? It was extremely difficult for Townsend to just flat out sever relations. He looked upon the man as a mentor and you know, a very, very close collaborator.
And well, so, and I'm sure he deserved a big chunk of the change, because he did make things happen. Maybe without him, they wouldn't be where they are either. So it's symbiotic, but one person shouldn't get everything or get the bigger chunk.
Yeah. I think. So the interesting thing about writing this novel was, one of the minor characters I wanted to use was Kit Lambert's father. And all I knew about him going in was that he was a composer and conductor in the classical world. That's all I knew. The more I dug into the father, the more interested I got in that guy, because he wasn't just in classical music. He was a leading music celebrity and intellectual of the 20s and 30s. He was extremely famous. He was a lot more famous than his son was. And his son grew up in the shadow of this guy who loomed huge in his, you know, worldview. Right. And so I got so interested in that guy, I wrote a novel about his father. So I have a duology. The first is called Constant Mayhem, is about Kit and the Who. Constant Motion is about his father working in ballet and his adventures in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Wow. And so it's interesting, and I really got a lot of material out of this particular family.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I'm a big fan of Pete Townsend. You know, I think he's one of the best songwriters ever. you know, and he's got a lot of, you know, drama around his
Yes.
life.
Yeah.
No, what are you going to do with the novel? Because I remember when we talked before, have you got a publish? Are you still trying to get a publishing, you know, going the traditional route?
Yeah, that's would be my goal. I don't want to self-publish. And so what I'm doing to build cred, hopefully, is getting these excerpts published. I mean, I wrote the book in almost a little snippets of thing, you know,
Mhm.
I dig very deeply into one point and then you skip a year and there's something else. And I realized that works very well for taking chunks out and giving them to magazines as short
Right,
stories. So
right.
I can hold up some of the covers. And because there's an element of crime in the early days, I actually got published by crime, indie crime. So this is
Oh, that's
Switch,
great.
Switchblade #7, which was a local production here in Los Angeles, and
Okay.
they published a chapter. And then Econoclash Review #4, a group out of Texas, same thing. And these are all like hard-boiled crime stories. And then my little chunks of the Who are in there. I got another piece in Switchblade #12,
Uh-huh.
and then I got a fourth one in an online. And so that's what's going on with that. I've got a few more pieces out to other places, and just hopefully at some point, you know, you build up enough. We're like, hey, 25% of this novel has been published. What do you think about a book deal? You know?
Yeah. I have every confidence in you, John.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating story. I mean, everybody has a story, but to put it in writing and make it interesting, and he sounds like a very interesting character. So
Yeah, he was a really
you know,
really fascinating guy on a number of levels. And again, for a novel, you wanted to have a lot of interior, and he was I would say a semi-closeted gay man in the 60s in London when it was still technically illegal to be gay.
Right.
He was out to his friends. What was interesting was Kit Lambert was out to people around him,
Mhm.
and yet, you know, with his parents and with the band, he would maintain the facade that he was straight.
Ah,
Um,
did he have a beard? I don't remember. Did he have a, you know, woman that he?
no, there was there was nothing
no
like
women.
that. So that's what I mean. He was kind of half in and half out,
Right.
and so you just get a lot of material out of that because it's
Yeah.
a different world. It's not that so long ago, but it's the mentality of that is you know, it's a bygone world. There was a time when he brought Pete Townsend as a young guy to live in the house because he wanted to cultivate him as a writer. He wanted him to focus
Mhm.
on writing, and so they had a spare room in their apartment. So Kit would bring home guys that he picked up, and the next morning he would always do this routine like, oh, this is a son of a friend of mine and you need a place to stay. And, you know, he would go through this whole thing
That's
pretending that there was some
Hiding
sort of excuse for it, even with Pete Townsend, who lives with him and certainly knows what's going on. I mean, you know, so it was a lot of fascinating stuff in the
That
story.
is
Sounds
interesting.
like it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love Kit. I just the more I learned about him, like this guy is just great with all his flaws and all his problems, and yet he had so many wonderful qualities and so many, you know, you got everything. That's what I look for in a story is what are the dynamics, the highs, the lows.
I feel like it'd be a really great screenplay at some point, you know?
That would be nice too. So first of all, we'll try and get the book done first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
#1 bestseller.
now they're actually making a movie right now about Brian Epstein, the
Oh, they are?
Beatles
Oh,
manager.
from the Beatles, John Lennon's Beatles.
Yeah, and that's also a story of a gay man from the provinces who, you know, struck it rich with rock and roll and kind of set the mold for a lot of these guys. You know, a lot of people like Kit Lambert wanted to be Brian Epstein.
Right.
That guy, you know, he was just from nowhere, and suddenly he's got the Beatles.
And was he in love with John Lennon? That was like the legend, right? That he sort of.
There was a really good movie done in 1991. It was called The Hours and Times by Christopher Munch, and he did a black and white movie about 3 days where John Lennon and Brian Epstein went to Spain, and nobody ever knew what happened on that trip. And he imagined those 3 days.
Right, right.
Beautiful thing. And I would say that was definitely an influence on me in that it showed you could do the manager. You could tell the story of the famous person and the behind the scenes person and get a good story out of it. So I love that story. And nobody knows what happened. You know, there is no record of what happened in those 3 days, but he explores that, you know, that what might have gone on between these guys. That's what
Hey, weren't you going to read a part of your book for us?
Oh yeah, I want to hear it.
Can you read a little snippet?
I would love to. Yes.
Can you? Something?
This is gonna when Kit Lambert first signs the band, he doesn't really know the guys that well.
Okay.
He works with Roger Daltrey because Roger was the band leader. And
Oh.
then it came to the point where you need a writer, and he's starting to think about, well, who in this band could be a writer? So about a third of the way into the book, I really introduced Pete Townsend as a character. And this is sort of my introduction to Pete and what he was like at 19 years old.
Got it.
To whom in this world should we really give thanks, Pete wondered. Were our joys and sorrows doled out by some Judeo-Christian construct with a long golden beard? Or was it fate, or Buddha, or the stars? And if the theologians and philosophers couldn't agree after thousands of years, wasn't it equally plausible that the one true supreme being was Charles Mingus? Wasn't that an easier pill to swallow? Dear Charlie, we thank you for all the blessings in this life, for food, for music, for bitter, and especially for cannabis. In your holy bebop name we pray, amen. Pete smiled dreamily as Jelly Roll faded, and then the needle got stuck in the play-out groove, producing a loop of hisses and pops. Rolling off the divan, he flipped Mingus back to side one and rummaged the clutter atop his bedroom coffee table for his rolling papers. His prayer was hardly facetious. His steady diet of good, strong Jamaican reefer was surely all that stood between him and the madhouse. Pete blamed his family. On starting college, he was amazed to discover that normal people were generally calm and only occasionally agitated. Growing up Townsend, those states were reversed. People were generally agitated and only occasionally calm. Pete accepted his daily flux of anxiety, fear, shame, disgust, and loathing as a mark of character, the way soldiers secretly relish the trauma of combat. The metaphor was apt. Pete was indeed battle-hardened, trained to fight from birth, though his weapons and armor were emotional. And like so many of his parents' generation who came back from the war shell-shocked, it was the interludes of peace that most tortured him. Calm was only a sham. Pleasantry, kindness, sympathy, those were the bluffs your enemy used to buy time, to gather force, to distract you from the next rapid punch. Suddenly anxious, Pete shut off the record player, took up his guitar instead. Snapping on his Fender Vibro Champ, he plugged in, ran the little start-stop pattern he'd been messing about with, but he couldn't shake his thoughts. Home was war. Family was war. The band was war. And he could slag off the first two, but the band was essential. He needed the Who to play his music, for music was his salvation. And it had been since the day his father took him to see the Blackboard Jungle. When Rock Around the Clock came blasting out of those Odeon theater speakers, every kid was on his feet yelling and screaming, while the adults folded their arms and harumphed at the gutter snipe and pertinence. And that was before they got wind of Elvis. Being only 10, Pete was in no position to deem the new sound a sea change, but his dad saw it quite clearly. If this keeps on, son, your mother and I will be looking for a new line of work. Cliff Townsend didn't love rock and roll, but he didn't hate it either, like all the other grown-ups. He understood what it was and where it derived from. In truth, he seemed almost relieved, as though 15 years of trad jazz was more than any culture should reasonably stand. Even though he and the Squadronaires would continue booking festivals and holiday camps for years to come. Their music was part of the war, after all, and the war could never be forgotten. What Pete learned, tagging along on all those suburb residencies, was that music was his parents' miracle cure. No matter how ugly their rows off stage, their performances were an emotional oasis. Trad jazz had a formulaic, almost mathematical logic to it, the democratic blending of rhythm, woodwinds, brass, and vocals, civilized even the most antagonistic performers, and lulled the audience into a reverie like an endless VE day. The trouble was, the show could only last so long, and one needed to fill the intervening non-performance time. Other aspects of music helped. There was practicing, listening to records, transposing charts, reading the trade papers. But his parents could only do so much, 4 or 5 hours a day. Now, assuming they slept 6 hours a night, well, that still left 12 or more hours every day with absolutely nothing fucking to do but drink and get on each other. Pete drank as well, but he wasn't a drinker, not in the way one understands the term when raised by drinkers. A pint of bitter was fine as social lubricant, but alcohol was too unpredictable to consistently ease his psychological disarray. Drunk, he might sob over his mom's Edith Piaf records, or take a swing at the corner bobby with a broken bottle. Getting soused was Russian roulette. Packed off to Ealing Art School at 16, however, he soon met cannabis as an adjunct of jazz and blues records. Pete was intimidated at first. What schoolboy hadn't heard whispers of the devil's cig? But he much admired the hipster seniors who smoked it. And you never saw any of them carry on like the grown-up nutters who haunted every corner pub. Pete suspected he'd enjoy cannabis, but never imagined he'd find in it a second salvation. The peace it brought him was identical to what he felt with music. It was pure and beautiful, miraculously devoid of the ugly subconscious discomfort he'd previously associated with peace. Good music was heaven and good cannabis nirvana. Taken together, the world was bliss. And one of the things he enjoyed most about being a working musician was the time, money, and access that allowed him to fully indulge in both.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's always was my favorite, one of my favorite pieces in the writers group. That's
Yeah,
why
it was always fun to read and it was fun to bring in. And yeah.
I know, because and then you had that character of Margot Fontaine. Remember?
That was Kit's father's ballerina lover. She was the most famous ballerina in England from the 30s, really up until the, she was a world famous ballerina.
Sure.
And she had a large, almost entirely secret affair with Kit's father, who was the musical director of her company. And and that's very much A Star Is Born. Margot was on her way up as a young kid. He was famous, but on his way down. Kit's father, got famous very young and then, kind of faded away. And it's it's a very sad story. And he had many of the same self-destructive qualities that Kit had. So there's a real sort of parallel effect between the generations. So
we often repeat the mistakes of our parents.
Yep. Very similar characters. But again, as the more I studied each guy, the more each guy made sense to me. I understood more about Kit because of his father and vice versa. So it really allowed me to go in depth on both the guys to have this sort of family thing.
Yeah. Well, that was great. So we'll have to have you on again as you announce your publishing deal.
Yeah.
I would love to come back. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting story. I really hope it happens because I think a lot of people would like to read this story.
Thank you.
Especially when, the famous musicians, we all know their story. It's been in the news and they've been interviewed a million times, but the behind the scenes people who also have very interesting stories we don't hear about. So I think that's fascinating that you chose someone like Kit.
And my approach to that is, if the Who fan is going to read it, they don't want to read the same thing they've read a million times.
Yeah, sure.
You can know everything in the world about the Who, and I want to show you something new. So it should go for fans, and it should go for people who've never heard of it. And I want it to be entertaining for people who don't even like rock music.
Right.
If you want to pull out the record and hear what I'm talking about, fine, but you don't have to. The story should work on the page by itself, and that's the goal that I set for myself.
Especially that time period. I love that time period, because it's, I wish I would have been a young adult in the mod scene. It was just so cool.
Exactly. And what's interesting about Kit is because he's 10 years older than the kids, he looks at it a different way. He's looking at it as a grown-up.
Right.
And, and it's that's what I like is the perspective. We know the 60s perspective on the mod scene and swinging one and all that. But to have an adult look at it and what can we do with this and where do I fit in and how can we make something happen here? That's absolutely fascinating. I think most rock fans dream of being a rock star, and someone like me, I've dreamed wouldn't it be great to be one of those guys who, worked at a record label or managed a band or something. Right. That to me is the great fantasy. So I'm writing my own.
Right.
Yeah.
In your own world that you wish
living vicariously. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Jon. And we'll have a link under the podcast to how to get buy your books and your articles and whatever.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Whatever you want to share.
Yeah, whatever you want to share.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jon. Thanks for coming on.
Good day.
Good luck.
Be safe.
You too. Bye.